Hello everyone, welcome back to On The Fly. Today we're going to be looking at 40 through 31 of our 2021-2022 NHL trade bait board. If you haven't already, be sure to go check out part 1. Link can be found in the description below so you can see where we are up to this point. We did start at 50. We're going to be going down to the top player. And we are going to be doing this in a little series, 5 parts each day of the week. We are going to be releasing a new episode. So we'll get right into it today with number 40, starting off with Joonas Korpisalo from the Columbus Blue Jackets. His contract is currently valued at $2.8 million, and he's going to expire on a UFA after this year. So when you take a look at a guy like Korpisalo, he's a goalie, obviously, so the value isn't necessarily as high, but to some teams, being a young goalie at that and having that expiring year, the Blue Jackets are going to want to move him, especially because it is more than likely that he is not necessarily their starter anymore. Obviously, with Elvis Merzlikins starting to come into form, I don't necessarily expect Korpisalo to be sort of that main guy they look upon. And when you can trade a guy for value, especially when it does not look as much like he's coming back, it's always a good time to do that. And especially when it comes to a trade deadline, there are quite a few teams, most notably the Oilers, that are looking for a goalie right now. And I do expect Korpisalo to be among the contenders with the Oilers, especially because they do need a goalie. Mike Smith, Mikko Koskinen not quite being up to snuff for them right now. But it is going to be interesting to see what the Oilers end up doing. That is one of their big concerns. But it is going to be pretty interesting to see, because obviously when you take a look at the Oilers, they are a very good team. They're just missing some key assets. And I think when you really start to dig down and take a deeper look at them, they have the potential to go on a deep cup run, potentially bringing the first cup to Canada since '93. But they are missing that sort of big key goaltending piece. And I think if they can really figure that out at the trade deadline, there's no reason why they shouldn't be considered high-end contenders, especially coming down the stretch well into the playoffs. Taking a look at the next player on this list at number 39, we have Brock Nelson. So Nelson does have a 16-team no-trade clause, so he's going to give a list to the Islanders, and he's not going to be able to be allowed to get traded to those 16 teams. So sort of present that 16-team list that he is willing to get traded to. So it is going to be interesting to see if they do decide to trade him. Obviously, Brock Nelson is a staple of the New York Islanders. His contract is $6 million, and at the end of this year, he will have 3 years left on his contract. So he does have term, he does have the money, but at the same time, I think when you look at the player that Brock Nelson is, and with the team the Islanders have put together this year, they aren't necessarily that high-end team that we've seen from years past. I am looking, at least interested to see, because mainly, if you take a look at the Islanders right now in the standings, they're not where they want to be, especially when you take a look at where the wild card is. They're about 8 to 10 points back of the next place team with Washington, and they don't have the games in hand that they once did. So it is going to be interesting to see where the Islanders see themselves, especially when you start coming down that stretch. As we are about 3 or so weeks away from the trade deadline, whether or not they're going to consider themselves sellers or buyers. And I do expect them to start to maneuver towards that seller role. They have quite a few high-end players. We will see quite a few Islanders on these lists, and we think we do have 3 today. So it's going to be interesting to see where the Islanders sort of sit, mainly because they aren't where they once were, and they don't really have that rebuilding ability yet. They do have a few good young players, but at the end of the day, they are a very aging team, and they're going to want to sort of get their contracts under control, and to do so, they are going to have to shed some cap. And one of these players that we will look at is Brock Nelson. Another would be someone like Josh Bailey and Kyle Palmieri, because these guys aren't necessarily going to be the part of their future when you look at their rebuilding. So I am looking forward to seeing what goes on there. Moving, that'll be number 39. We'll take a look at number 38 now, as I previously mentioned, with Josh Bailey coming in at $5 million for 2 years left after this year on his contract. So very similar to Brock Nelson, although I think Bailey is a little bit more likely. Can you take a look at the captaincy? Brock Nelson currently does wear the A, and when you really start to crack down, they don't really want to trade their captains, mainly because it sort of shows that they're giving up on their leadership. They think they're failing. And there's all these sort of subtle messages that come across when you do trade your captain. But I think when you really look at it, the Islanders right now, I think Bailey is a very likely guy to go because he does have a quite high of a cap hit, and they don't necessarily need him, especially when you take a look where the Islanders are. I think he'd much prefer to be outside chasing a deep cup run with a contending team. I don't know where he'd go at this point because there are quite a few contenders that could potentially score. A guy like Josh Bailey, when he does get on his hot streak, he's sort of that player that goes up and down. If he can find it, he can be a menace, especially when it comes to the playoff time. If he can hit that hot streak on the right foot, there is absolutely no reason why he cannot be as good as any of the top players on this list. But I am looking forward to seeing what the Islanders end up doing. And that will be number 38. Taking a look at number 37 will be Alexander Radulov. So for Radulov, he does have a 15-team no-trade list. And he is valued at $6.25. And at the end of the year, he will become an unrestricted free agent. So when you take a look at a guy like Radulov, he's going to be interesting to see what goes on because Radulov is most likely not going back to Dallas after this year. So when you really think about what Radulov brings, he's a tough player. He can play sort of second line role, but I do definitely see him more as a third line guy. The contract is a little bit higher. When you take a look at what the Stars are going to be doing, they are in that contending spot right now. But at the end of the year, I don't think they see themselves as a high-end contender. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not they decide to trade away their team, try and get into that rebuild, because their team is starting to age. You got players like Sagan, Pavelski, and of course with Radulov starting to get up there in age, there might be time for the Dallas Stars to go into that rebuild. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they do come deadline time because they are definitely a team to watch when it comes to rebuild or go for it, because this is sort of their last years before they're forced to go into the rebuild. So I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there with the Dallas Stars. So that's Radulov at 37. We're on number 36 with James Van Riemsdyk. So Riemsdyk does come in at $7 million over 1 year left on his contract, and he is a very good player, but unfortunately his contract is not where it should be. So when I take a look at sort of on the list, most of these guys I do value around a third-round pick. Kessel, I know the asking price is a third-round pick, and I do expect him to go for that. But when you take a look at a guy like JVR, the only reason why he's not higher on this list is because of his contract. Right, it's $7 million for really sort of that second-line kind of player. He's going to score a lot of goals in front of the net. He's sort of that crafty end power play guy that has the hands to be sort of the net front presence. But at the end of the day, I think a team that really could use them would be a team like Boston, maybe, because they are starting to struggle. You can really see them struggling on the power play so they're sort of missing that high-end net front presence, and I am looking forward to seeing what goes on there, because right now that guy is Foligno for Boston. I think they could really use him, a guy like JVR. Also, never count out the team like the Leafs, but of course they are going to have to get in that little bit of a cap crunch. With Muzzin coming back, it is a little bit a step in the right direction, although the term is going to be a little bit concerning because Philly most likely won't be taking on that extra cap hit just because they aren't in necessarily a great situation themselves. They do want to be able to sort of have cap liquidity come next year to make that sort of playoff push, which I do think that they are going to be a contender next year with a guy like Giroux. He also is another player that is going to appear on this list at some point. No spoilers. But with that, James Van Riemsdyk does come in at number 36 on the list. Moving down to number 35 was a former Philadelphia Flyer, Robert Hagg, currently playing in Buffalo. So when you take a look at Hagg, 1.6, and he's a UFA. And he really is a very solid player. Although the one concern I have is that he isn't necessarily that high-end guy. He can be valued as sort of the bottom four, not necessarily the top four, but the bottom four defensemen, so somewhere on that second line, third line kind of player. But he does have a very cheap cap hit at $1.6 million. And I think when you look at a player for their overall cap hit, and especially a player that you're trying to buy cheap, Hagg is a great option, especially right now. And a lot of teams could use that sort of depth defenseman that can really play. And I think when you look at sort of a lot of these high-end teams, every one of them is sort of lacking that sixth and fifth defenseman. And I think if you can address that with a cheap option like $1.6 million with Robert Hagg, I think he is going to be a very hot to buy player. And the only reason why he's not higher up on this list for me is because the talent necessarily isn't quite there compared to some of the other guys on our list. And I think he is, at the end, you could argue him for a second round pick for sure. But at the end of the day, I think he is worth sort of that third to fourth round pick range. Of course, there's also player compensations, but when we take a look at overall players, I kind of value them off of draft pick status. And I think for Hag, he's sort of valued around that third or fourth round pick. So then with him coming in at 35, number 34 with Alexander Georgiev coming at $2.425 million, and he will become a restricted free agent next year with arbitration eligible. So unfortunately for the Rangers, they already have Shesterkin, but unfortunately they are going to have quite the debacle in front of them with arbitration coming. Georgiev can demand quite a bit. And he is a player as a future of basically his future. He has quite a bunch of upside, right? Another team that I think, once again, sort of cycling back to that goalie idea, a team like the Oilers, once again, because they are lacking that goaltender option. I think if they can get a guy like Georgiev, who's sort of been overshadowed this year. He is a very good goalie. I honestly sort of rank him in that top 30. He's better than some starters right now in the NHL. Unfortunately for him, though, he has been outshadowed by Igor Shesterkin. So I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there, because obviously if he's playing for playing time, he's not quite getting it right now, but on a different team, which I think he will start to request a trade out, mainly because he wants to play, as most people would. Unfortunately for him, he just hasn't quite got that playing time. So I am looking for the Rangers to try and get some compensation, preparing them for a playoff run this year, and sort of having to avoid the high-end cap hit that's going to come, mainly because they don't have a lot to work with right now. They have quite a few players that are starting to come to their end of their contract. There will be some more Rangers coming up on the coming up in the list for the days to come, so be sure to tune in for that. So that's 34 with Alexander Georgiev. I'm going to number 33 with Phil the Thrill Kessel. So for him, he has an 8-team trade list that he can be traded to, and his cap hit is $6.8 million, and he's a UFA. Of course, the 1.2 was already retained by the Leafs. His original contract was 8 over 8 back in the day when he was a Toronto Maple Leaf before he was traded to the Penguins. And so when you take a look at a guy like Phil Kessel, he is a player that is going to be a high-end sort of right winger. I see him sort of in that second or first line role, but unfortunately for him, it's another situation where the cap hit's really high, and the trade clauses aren't necessarily in his benefit. One of the big issues with Phil is that he isn't necessarily in the same condition he once was. When you take a look at him with the Leafs, with the Bruins, he was sort of that really high-end, fast skating guy, and he had a great shot. And right now he really has that great shot, but his skating is really starting to lack. So I could see him going pretty much anywhere, because a lot of teams are looking for that kind of guy, a guy with some veteran leadership, and really just a guy that has the ability to play day in, day out. I think he is going to be a very high and a hot-to-trot player this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Arizona decides to do with him come deadline day. And with that for the Phil Kessel is 33. 32 is Andrew Kopp from Winnipeg. So with Kopp, $3.64 million, and at the end of the year, he will become an unrestricted free agent. And I think with the Jets, they are going to want to trade Kopp, mainly because when you take a look at where he is right now, he's not necessarily their best winger, right? For Kopp, he's mainly going to be that third line sort of guy. He has the ability to play second line, but at the end of the day, I think it's better for them to get some sort of stuff back, their profit back, for the player that Kopp is, because he is most likely going to walk in free agency. Unfortunately for Jets fans, it is just sort of going to happen, because right now he's not getting nearly the playing time that he should. So I think when you take a look at a guy like Kopp, he is very likely, at least, to move on, and I think if you can get some value for him before he leaves, it's never a bad thing. So I do expect Kopp to be on the move, and that will bring to number 31. And that will be Kyle Palmieri from the New York Islanders. So for him, he has a full no-trade clause. So if he doesn't want to move, he's not going to move. And I think for Palmieri, he's starting to get up there in age. And when you really start to take a look at him, he has $5 million and for 3 years left on his contract. And I think this is probably going to be the final ride for Palmieri. And overall, when you take a look at Palmieri, he wants to win a cup. And unfortunately for the Islanders, they're just not quite in that position anymore. Sort of taking a look at sort of that ride or die idea behind the Islanders right now is going to be definitely something to watch. If they decide to start trading guys near the deadline, Palmieri might request to trade out, waive his no-trade clause, and allow the Islanders to get some profit for him right now. There's no rush necessarily to get Palmieri out, but it is definitely an intriguing option for a lot of teams because, once again, he is nearing his end years, especially in the NHL. So I'm very excited to see what happens with Palmieri, especially what will happen with the New York Islanders, because obviously, depending on what they do, a lot of stuff's going to happen for them at this trade deadline. If you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you really liked it, consider subscribing, tell all your friends, and be on the lookout for part 4 of the NHL Trade Bait Board. Until next time, see ya.